You know, it's interesting. Jerry Spinelli, you know, there are two great prizes in children's literature. One is the Newbery Medal, and the other is the Caldecott. And Jerry Spinelli won the Caldecott this year. Wrote me a funny little letter, not the one that's described here, but I like to think that he was started by the confidence of Jerry, of Woody Allen knowing who he was. Well, we have some time for some questions. Any questions? Yes.
Well, I have a two-part question, Mr. Plimpton,
Thank you for throwing in the L.
There were reports that he was either going to be the subject of a TV special or a movie. What's the status of that?
Of what?
Sid Finch.
Oh, Sid Finch. I better explain who Sid Finch is. 4 years ago, I think it was, I was called into Sports Illustrated because it turned out that they had an issue coming up with April 1 on the cover, April Fool's Day. And although it's a magazine devoted to truth, presumably, they felt they should have some fun on this particular date. And they asked me if I had any ideas. And the first thing I thought of doing was to write a long repertorial article on famous hoaxes in practical jokes. I've been led to think of this because the year before, my roommate at Cambridge University had sent me a rather wonderful story that appeared on April 1st in the British press. You know, the English press has great fun on April 1. All the papers have an April Fool's story. So does the BBC. The BBC, about 20 years ago, had a very famous documentary came on prime time. And there was Richard Dimblesby, who was the great sort of Walter Cronkite of England. And what he was doing was describing spaghetti farming. And there were these people raking spaghetti out of trees on the French-Italian border. Here it was on the BBC, and people fell for it, you know. Anyway, this friend of mine, 5 years ago or so, sent me this wonderful piece from I think it was the Daily Mail. And it was about a Japanese marathon runner who had turned up in London to run in the London Marathon. Couldn't speak the language at all, and he got everything confused. And he thought he was to run not for 26 miles, but for 26 days. And he had dissipated into the countryside. And he'd been spotted, you know, running by a petrol station in East Anglia. And his wife had called from Osaka and said that he was, you know, very determined and was worried about him and so forth. Absolutely straightforward. I fell for it. You tend to forget these distinguished papers. You don't see the April one there. This year, for example, the story I remember that he sent me some this year. One of the Observer had a marvelous story on that the heel stone at Stonehenge had gotten slightly out of kilter. So they were going to move Stonehenge to Snowdon. And a Japanese consortium had gotten involved and offered 49 billion yen to move Stonehenge to Mount Fuji. I didn't fall for that one, but that's the sort of thing they do in the... At any rate, I tried to put together a whole story about these practical hoaxes and jokes and April Fool's things dealing with sport, and there really wasn't enough. So the editor at Sports Illustrated looked at me one day at a conference across the table and he said, "George, why don't you do your own?" And that was a very heady thing to be asked to do because it meant that he was giving me license to try to fool 600,000 subscribers to Sports Illustrated. And almost instantly this idea came to mind. The baseball season was coming up, and there came into my mind this sort of superhuman pitcher, guy who could throw the ball at astonishing speed. Actually, it turned out to be 168 miles an hour with absolute accuracy. And the only way that you had to be a foreigner, because anybody that could do that would, of course, be recognized in the high schools of the country or in the, in the minor leagues or whatever. So I made him a Englishman who had gone to Tibet to try to find his father who had died in an airplane crash and had become entranced by the whole sort of mind over matter business there, and had ended up in a monastery where he had learned mind over matter, to throw a baseball with absolute accuracy, any object for that matter, and felt finally that the baseball was a thing that he should practice. And he had turned up in the Mets training camp in St. Petersburg. Wasn't sure that he wanted to play. His name was Sid Finch, Sid for Sid Hartha, 2 Ds. And he wasn't sure that he wanted to play baseball because there were a lot of things about baseball that did not apply to his tantric beliefs. Stealing second, hidden ball trick, things like that. So he was pitching in seclusion. And I wrote this long piece about Sid Finch, and it appeared April 1, I think it was 4 years ago now. And it was buttressed, this piece, by extraordinary photographs taken of a school teacher outside of Chicago, tall, gawky man with a tiny little head, about 27 or 8, who looked exactly like what was in my mind's eye, just by chance. And the article came out, and an awful lot of people fell for it. To this day, I don't know quite what. Some people were outraged. Sports Illustrated got 2,000 letters about this fellow. I think probably it was wish fulfillment, perhaps. In any case, I got fascinated by Sid Finch, and I wrote a novel about him. Well, it's not a novel, it's, he exists. It's a report about him, because I got interested in what would happen if someone like that did turn up in baseball. Because you'd have to change the game. He'd become a sort of a pariah. Because baseball is a constant fixing of the relationship between the pitcher and the batter. In the early days of baseball, the pitcher used to throw the ball underhand, and the batter could ask where he wanted it. And obviously the batter would pulverize the pitchers. So then they allowed the pitcher to throw overhand from 45 feet. And he subdued the batter. So they moved the pitcher back to that mysterious distance of 60 feet, 6 inches. They're always tinkering with this balance. And it's the balance between the two that makes this game so remarkable. So what happens if, you have a fellow like this Sid Finch who comes in and begins to, he's a pariah, he begins to destroy the game. So what are you going to do about it? What's the mob going to do about it? What is the commissioner? In fact, I went to see Mr. Uberoth, who was the commissioner at the time, and he said that he would, he has the best interests of baseball, told me that he had that in mind. He would have to do something, and he would decree, if Sid Finch turned up, that overachieving Buddhists, as he put it, would have to throw the ball from center field. At any rate, the book came out. It was well received, I think, and Hollywood is now trying to do it. We'll have to wait and see what they will do with it. But it is going to be made into that's a long answer to your question, but it is going to be made into a film. Any more questions? Yes?
Do you have any comments on the women in the locker rooms?
The question was about the women in the locker rooms. I must say, it was startling for a while there, particularly in basketball, where if the men stand up. The first one I ever saw was a reporter from Sports Illustrated who was 5'3" around in there, tiny little girl. Her father was a great reporter for the New York Post, and I can't remember her name now. And when Wilt Chamberlain would stand up and she would interview him, it was a sight that you just couldn't get out of your mind for quite a long while. I don't know why they can't wear towels and do sensible things like that, but I think it's overblown, that whole controversy. People get really quite used to it now. So I suppose it'll go by the wind. It'll be natural. I don't think the men will ever be allowed into the women's locker rooms, which is sort of a shame. Yes? Yes, the question was about flying on a trapeze. I joined the Cole Brothers, the Cole Brothers, what on earth was it? Clyde Beatty Cole Brothers Circus. And I was a lion trainer and a clown and a trapeze artist. I joined a group called the Flying Apollos. And there were 4 of them. There were 2 young men, I think plucked off the California beaches. They can do triple jumps off the sand, that sort of thing. And a tiny little girl, very much like the girl in the locker room. She was about 4'2", with a great hairdo that kicked her up to about 5'8". And they were the flyers. The flying act is divided into two parts. They're the flyers, and they're these rather small people, very lithe and limber. And they climb up to the little platform here. And they grab a hold of, each in turn grab a hold of the trapeze bar, and they soar across the circus to the other member of the flying act, who is the catcher. And he's over here on his trapeze, going back and forth. And the fellow on the flyer then lets go of the trapeze and does the triple, even the quadruple, which is the great thing to do now, spins in the air. And as the flyer falls, he or she is caught by the catcher, and the two of them go out and then back, and then they flip off and get onto the original trapeze and soar back up to where they started, a little platform there. Well, I had to be a flyer. I couldn't handle the catching business. I weigh 200 pounds, 6 feet 4. They used to call me the flying telephone pole. And the trick I was supposed to do was a very simple one, simply to get my feet to the catcher, and and it's called a feet across. It's the simplest of the flying maneuvers. Well, I could not get to the catcher. You know, I would lurch off this platform and tumble into the net. There's a net. And I was either holding it wrong or not having quite enough strength to do it properly. I worked on it for about a month, and I could only, very rarely would get to the catcher, and then there'd be some sort of a catastrophe there. So finally, this was all being filmed to make a documentary. So finally the filmmakers decided that perhaps the pressure of a public performance would force me to get this trick done, the feet across. So I had to perform one afternoon in North Philadelphia, Clyde Beatty Cole Brothers, great tent circus, the last of the great tent circuses. And the morning of my performance, I woke up and my shoulders were in terrible shape. The arms kept being pulled out of the sockets, and so the whole area there was discolored, purple, hemorrhaging. And the trainer at the circus suggested that I ought to go down and try to get some pain-killing shots that it might help my performance that afternoon. And with the performance about maybe a couple hours away, I flung a raincoat over my leotards and went down to the North Philadelphia hospital to the emergency ward there. And I walked in. There were quite a lot of people in there. In fact, some of them were from some construction crew. They had hard hats on, and they were getting, I don't know, flu shots or something like that. We all had to stand in line. And I got up to the intern who was sitting there at this desk, this guy with a stethoscope, and he said, "What's wrong with you?" And I flung back this. And there I was. There was sort of a murmur went up from everybody there. And I'm not at my best in pink leotards. And the intern said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a flyer." More murmurs. And I said, I'm up there with the circus, and I've been having a lot of trouble with my shoulders. They keep pulling out of the sockets, and I need, as you can see, some attention here. This intern then said the most remarkable thing. Maybe this is the way they talk in North Philadelphia. He said, "I'm not going to give you any pain-killing chemicals." He said, "The human body is a cathedral, and you've desecrated it." Boy, don't get hurt in North Philadelphia, I want to tell you. So I had to go back up and perform without medical assistance, aid. And it was interesting, the confusion of this crowd. What you do when you go out, you march out, the flying Apollos, we're all in a row. And then the catcher went down here. They must have thought there were two catchers there for a while. And I towered over the flyers, and we all climbed up this little ladder to the platform, the flyers' platform, and you could hear people saying, "My God, look at the size of that flyer." This great expanse of pink tights and everything. And anyway, we got up to this little platform, and the other three Apollos, the two young men and the young girl, they were the first to perform. They wanted me to be the sort of, the climax of this performance, and they did that. And what I did when I was waiting is you do what's called styling if you're not actually performing, and styling is to receive applause for the rest of the troupe. Now, I suppose the best example is a magician, who's working under all these balls and knives and things, and right beside him or her stands usually a very pretty young woman, and she occasionally styles for him, as if she were completely responsible for what's going on. Well, that's all I did up there on the platform. These tricks would be done, the double, the triple, and so forth. And when they'd get back up there, I would... In fact, that's probably what they thought my only function was. That was why I was so large, a great, huge styler. Well, finally, of course, my moment came, and I stepped to the front of of this little platform, and I hung on to the bar. It's very heavy, it weighs about 13 pounds, really tugs at you like that. And way at the other end of the circus, the catcher began to go back and forth. And you practice this endlessly, because when he gets to a certain point in the arc of his swing, he goes, hop! And you have to go at that instant. If you go a half a second later than that, or a half a second before, when you get over there, he's not there anymore. So I heard him go, hop! And off I went, managed to hang on this time, soaring across the circus towards him. I could see he was hanging upside down. I could see his eyes getting bigger as he suddenly realized he was going to have to contend with me. And I stuck my legs under his shoulders there and let go of the bars. A great grunt went from him. Two of us went out and then back, and he tried to put me up onto the little trapeze bar. It was dangling in front of me like this. And I got one finger on it like that, and tumbled into the net with a great crash. Wobbled there for a while, and I got up, and you know how you do wobble when you stand in one of those things sort of like this, and I looked at this rather bewildered audience, 5,000, and I went, thank you very much.